If I could just say to our viewers, this is an outstanding Australian, this woman, because this particular problem she's lived with. Now, Jacinta, I know it's hard to revisit this, but many of your family still live in these town camps. You've described them as hellholes. You lost your cousin, Regina, in December, only a couple of months ago, a 42-year-old non-drinker who lived her whole life in a town camp. It was 2 days after Christmas. You said that her death could be attributed to the stress and conditions of living in one of these hellholes, and that drunken families, even people who didn't know Regina, would turn up in her house, go through the fridge, eat everything, so they would never have food. Now, your words, and I quote, they could never, ever, ever really just live a life that was about themselves. There were always people drinking at night, people drunk at night, and violence. And then you said this, having sat by the hospital bed, this is awful stuff, having sat by the hospital bed those last few days in a palliative care unit with my cousin, she was happy to die. She was so ready to be at peace because that was really the only peace she was ever going to get, to ultimately die. And then you said the sad thing, that is their normal. To everyday Australians living on the northern beaches or something like that, it's a complete and utter world away. It's like Beirut. You could never fathom it unless you actually live there. Jacinta, how will anything the federal government is doing, including this wretched voice, which we should have nothing to do with, listen to this voice, we've got a voice, how will anything address these issues?
Well, like I said, it takes being really, really honest about what's going on. If we were to do anything substantial, we would be reviewing where all this funding, these millions and billions of dollars have been going over these years to address this disadvantage, and failing to do so and holding to account those people on six-figure salaries in Aboriginal organisations who are supposed to produce outcomes. And I'd say, if there are programs and organisations that are being successful, then yes, invest further into them. But otherwise, do away with those that aren't, and hold people to account for failing to deliver.
$30,000 million, $30,000 million every year, $30,000 million to so-called close the gap, and the gap gets wider. Look, the unfashionable question to ask, I mean, didn't the so-called stolen generation arise because attempts were made to save children from these atrocities?
That's absolutely right. I mean, that was the narrative that was kept from the Australian people. But Australians aren't stupid. And there are a lot of people who, Indigenous Australians who are part of the supposed stolen generation, who understand, in fact, their circumstances came about because they were removed for the fact that they were in dysfunctional situations. And they appreciate the fact that they were given an opportunity to have a better life and to have an education. And if you look at the current state of play, look who is running those Aboriginal organisations. They are people who predominantly come from the stolen generation. Those who weren't removed, those with their first language who's not English, those that are still living connected to traditional culture are the most marginalised Aboriginal Australians. And they should be where we focus our efforts, not on elites who want to have their positions internally embedded into the Constitution, so their jobs are maintained, so the gravy train is maintained, and so the gap remains
wider
there.
And wider.
Because
see how many people
ultimately,
sorry.
I was going to say, ultimately, we want the gap to close.
Yes.
But the voice is suggesting it'll never be closed because there'll always be disadvantage.
How many people governing us in capital cities across the country would want their kids living in these circumstances?
Absolute zero. Not even the Minister for Territory Families would put her children back out in those dysfunctional, horrible households where her children would be at risk of sexual abuse, neglect, all of those things that is allowed to happen to Aboriginal kids. That to me is the ultimate racism, that lowering of standards and not upholding the human rights of Australian children.
Jacinta, There are thousands and thousands of people watching you at the moment, and I know what they're saying. This woman is our Australian of the Year. I want to say to you what I've said to you before. You've got a platform here whenever you need it. You're a wonderful, wonderful human being. Thank you for your courage and your commitment. Time to get off and have a feed and a sleep. But thank you for joining us tonight. There she is, Senator
Thank you so
Jacinta
much.
Price.